Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 18th of April, 2016, Matthew Taylor discussed the power to create.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming out on a Monday evening to listen to me speak. It's nice to be in a dance studio. Totally inappropriate for me to be in a dance studio, I have to say. I'm one of those people who only dances when they're drunk. About a year ago, I made the mistake of drinking too much and dancing, and I noticed my son had his head in his hands. And I said to him, look, I'm sorry. I said, I know. Someone once said that I dance like a wounded spider on Valium. And he said, that's not fair. He said, you dance like a wounded spider's dad on Valium. So here I am at a dance studio. Maybe though deep inside me there is somebody who can dance. Who knows? I'm sure that the people here who are professionals would say that everyone can dance given the right opportunity, the right support, and they release their inhibitions. I have myself chosen to express my kind of middle-aged desire to express myself through learning the guitar very badly though. Don't ask me to play anything. But that's great. It's great to be able to choose how I want to express my creativity, as it was kind of drummed out of me at school on the basis of me having no talent at all. Now that kind of relates to what I want to talk to you about today. So the phrase that will occur a few times, what I have to say, is power to create. And power to create is the mission, the modern mission of the RSA, the organisation that I run. We've been around 260 years, so our mission has changed a few times over the years. But I like to think this idea of power to create reflects that history, but brings it up to date. What do we mean by it? What we mean is incredibly simple. We mean by it that our aspiration is that everybody should be able to live a life in which they have a sense of being the author of their own lives, a sense of agency and a sense of creativity, so that everybody should have that sense that their life is their own life, that they are the authors of their life, that they have a sense of agency, and that they can be creative in the way in which they live their lives. Now that's an incredibly simple idea, and I'm not the first person to express it as an aspiration. But we don't talk about it quite as much as you would have thought, given that it's surely the most obvious of aspirations that we would have for the human race. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that philosophers have often in the past actually talked about this idea. They have identified that the good life is not really a life in which you have unlimited power or unlimited possessions or unlimited fame. It is a life where you feel that sense of agency and creativity. You feel that sense of authorship over your own life. So Aristotle and other Greek thinkers would have identified that as being what life was all about. And philosophers have continued to do that. But generally speaking, when they said that, they weren't actually talking about everybody. They were generally speaking talking about educated middle-class men in whatever societies we're talking about. They weren't talking about women, they weren't talking about slaves, they weren't talking about various oppressed minority groups. So the idea that the good life is a life of agency and creativity is not new, but the idea that this might be something we pursue for everybody is a newer concept. I think the other reason we don't talk about it as much as we should is to do with individualism. So this idea that we are all unique and that we should all be able to express our creativity and our sense of agency is an individualistic idea. It emphasizes the importance of every individual, a deep account, a deep idea of freedom. But actually there's a kind of fault line with individualism when we think about it, because on the one hand, it speaks to that idea of recognizing every individual and every individual's dignity. On the other hand, individualism speaks to freedom and the idea that people should be able to do whatever it is that people want to do, and particularly to the notion of markets, which are a mechanism to allow people to do whatever they want to do. And the problem is that for a whole variety of reasons, if you have a society which is free, you quite quickly have quite big inequality, and then in that context, you're unable to give people the opportunity to have that sense of agency and creativity. So we're quite confused, really, about what we mean by freedom. On the one hand, it's an idea about respecting every individual, and on the other idea, it's about a society where some people do very well and other people do very badly. So when I talk about power to create, what I'm trying to do is bring those ideas together and say, ours should be a society where every individual has the freedom to be the person that they want to be. So to bring together those two notions of freedom. So that's the kind of background to this, and there's nothing, as I say, particularly remarkable or new about this, but I think what's more interesting, hopefully more interesting what I'm going to say, is why would that aspiration, the idea that everybody can have that sense of agency and creativity in their life, why would that be a realistic aspiration for us to have now? And I'm going to suggest to you a few reasons why. So the first is it appears to me that's what people want. You might think that, because we often kind of hear this, that all people want to do is go shopping, have huge TVs, or whatever it might be that we're told the public most want. Actually, surveys show, world value surveys, so the biggest survey of people all around the world, in a whole variety of different countries and cultures, shows that the number one thing that people say they want is what they call self-expression. So all around the world, the biggest aspiration that people express for themselves is this capacity to be able to express themselves fully in their lives. And that's true in relatively rich countries like ours, where most people's basic needs are met, but it's also true in much poorer countries. People still say, even when they lack many of the basic things, that the most important thing to them is that capacity to express themselves. So it feels like this notion of power to create, as we call it, is something that people want. That's important. The second thing that I think is changing in the world is that that is increasingly what it is we're demanding of people. So let's give you a couple of examples of that. First of all, employers. Employers used to say that what they really wanted was people who were obedient. Now, more and more employers say that what they want is people who have the capacity to take initiative, to show autonomy, to be entrepreneurial. Even the CBI, not the most radical of institutions normally, 18 months ago wrote a report saying that in many ways the education system is not focusing on the things that employers most want. It's not focusing enough on giving young people those kind of soft skills, as they're sometimes called, that kind of sense of self-confidence, the ability to communicate, to work in teams, to be creative, to be autonomous. So whether it's employers or some retailers as well wanting a different relationship with their customers, we're kind of on the lookout for fostering that kind of creative capacity in people. Possibly more pressingly also, the public sector. Now, I've spent years speaking to people in the public sector, in Whitehall and town halls, the health service, for years saying to them, they should try to move away from a model of public services being delivered to people, you know, like mail being delivered through the door. People talk about deliverology, as if public services are like letters that get pushed through the letterbox. In fact, of course, when you think about it, most public services are they're nothing like a delivery. They're actually something which emerges from a relationship. The relationship that people have with their doctor, or with their children's teacher, or with their university lecturer, or with their local police officer, or whatever. And as austerity has hit, one of the only good things about austerity is that it has forced people, even the most paternalistic of people, to say, actually, we've got to redesign public services so they become much better at tapping into people's own capacity to meet their own needs, individually and collectively. How can we design health systems to support people so that they can look after their own health and look after each other? How can we have education systems which enable people to take more initiative in relation to their own learning? We did a big piece of work for the Met Police in London a few months ago, and the core of that report was them wanting to say to the public, we cannot do all the things that you expect us to do. And if you carry on expecting us to do all the things you expect us to do, we won't be able to do the stuff that only we can do, the really serious stuff. So we need a different contract with the people of London. We need a clearer understanding. We need to build trust so that the public is more able to deal with the kind of low-level issues that we can't deal with anymore. So the public sector, too, wants a citizenry that is more creative, has more of a sense of agency, is more on the front foot, does things itself. And then there's a third thing, a third accelerator of this idea of universal creativity and agency, and that's technology. So a lot of what goes on the internet, social media, is a bit grisly and depressing. But that's the kind of dark side of what is amazing that's happening on the other side. And that is that never in human history has technology so rapidly torn down the barriers to people's creativity. So whether that's tens, hundreds of millions of people creating their own content and sticking it on YouTube or sharing it in a variety of ways, whether it's people setting up their own businesses in their own spare time or whatever. I was talking to someone the other day who said, you know, we used to model that you set up a business, you sell to your neighborhood, then you sell to your town, then to your city, then to your region, then to your nation, then one day you might sell abroad after about 20 years in business. Now, you know, you can make something and then you can be selling it on Etsy anywhere in the world if people particularly want the thing that you've created. So, you know, entrepreneurialism, sharing, campaigning, mobilizing. It's so easy to do these things now online that we've forgotten how hard it was to do them before this technology existed. So the internet and social media has torn down the barriers to people's creative self-expression. As I say, as individuals, as groups, as entrepreneurs, as creators of content, as sharers, as collaborators, as campaigners. So that's the positive side. Now I could finish now, couldn't I? That's fine. You know, that's all looking pretty rosy. I mean, you know, it doesn't necessarily feel that great all the time, but that's a pretty positive picture. And I'm a pretty positive person, but the second half of what I want to say is about the barriers that exist to the image, to the ideal that I've described. Because if it was all going to happen, then we wouldn't need the RSA, and I wouldn't be speaking to you and trying to urge you to think about how it is we can bring this vision about. So what are those barriers? The first one is that elitism that I described. You know, at the beginning I said that philosophers who talked about the good life kind of assumed it was just for people like them. Well, that elitism, we're a much more egalitarian society than we used to be, but that elitism still hasn't gone. Our education system is far too often still a kind of sieve to separate out the creative people from the people who aren't really creative, who just need to be kind of warehoused and managed. We judge our education system by people's ability to get through an increasingly kind of narrow system of exams and accreditation. And that's how schools are judged. Schools don't feel a lot of the time like very creative places. We have brilliant head teachers who do brilliantly despite the constraints they're under, but it's tough and it's getting tougher. In my view, we should judge our education system on one thing and one thing alone, and we should judge our education system by whether people leave it with a love of learning and a desire and a confidence to carry on learning throughout their life. I'd get rid of everything else, every other measure. I'd simply say, ask people at the end of their education, do you love learning and do you want to carry on learning and do you intend to carry on learning for the rest of your life? If we measured everything by that, we'd be in a better position. So that elitism still pervades our education system. It's also, I'm afraid, pervasive within our organisations. It's still the case that the model we have of organisations is a pyramid. And at the top, there's the creative people, the well-paid people, the high-status people, and then it goes down and down and down and gets wider and wider and more people, and they have less and less autonomy, and that's the way that the world has to be. Of course, the problem is that's not the way the world has to be at all. The world can be radically different. If you go onto the RSA website and put in the words Jos de Blok or Buurtzorg, which is the organisation he runs, you'll see a short talk from a brilliant Dutch guy. And I just want to tell you his story because it's so often we fall into that kind of viewing organisations as those kind of pyramids. So Jos, about 10 or 11 years ago, he came back to Holland. He'd been travelling around the world. He's a bit of a hippie. He came back to Holland. He wanted to get back into what he'd done before, which was community nursing. So he joined a local community nursing team. And what he found was that community nursing had been organised by kind of McKinsey-type people, and so it was incredibly efficient. Really good use of technology. And so people had 15-minute slots of time, and every morning they come in and they'd be told, these are the people you're going to go and visit in the community. And as they left their houses, they press their mobile device, and it would say, you've done your 15 minutes. And so it was very efficient, very well-managed system. There's only one problem with it. Everybody was as miserable as sin. All the nurses felt they didn't have time to really look after people. And all the people they were caring for had no idea who was going to come and see them that day, and they had these short interactions. Does anyone recognise any of that, by the way? So what did Jos do? Did he kind of accept it? No, what he did was, he said, well, I'm going to reorganise my team. And instead of each person having a slightly different job and all this, we're just a team. We're a single team. We have a community. There's a community of people we look after. And we're going to work out together how it is we look after those people. And we're going to put much greater emphasis on prevention and support. So the kind of thing that his team did was that when a new family moved into a street where there was someone they cared for, they'd go and knock on the door and say, by the way, there's someone across the road that I come in and see a couple of times a week. It'd be great if you could go over and say hello to them. Could I have your phone number so they could maybe ring you if they had any kind of problems? And people said, oh, that's fine, that's great. So that's the kind of thing they did. They all worked together, and it emphasised building relationships, because it turned out that the way in which you get people to feel more confident about looking after themselves is by building a relationship and spending time with them. So that's great. That's a story about hippie and 12 nurses, and isn't that great? Well, the great thing about Jos's story is that was 11 years ago. Jos now runs 70% of community nursing in Holland. And how does he run it? He runs the whole thing on the basis of those teams. There is no hierarchy. There are no managers. The head office for this organisation that employs thousands of nurses and provides most of the care is about 25 people. I once said to Jos, how do you manage? He says, I send a blog out every week. And then people kind of respond to my blog. And if they think it's a good idea, they kind of do it. And if they think it's a crap idea, they say, not a good idea, Jos. And I go, all right, fair enough. All that the teams do is that they're sent data, and if they're not performing well, they bring in a coach. And the coach works with the team, the whole team, and says, how is it we can do better? But that's how they work. And, of course, when he came to the RSA, being English and being kind of miserable and cynical, I kind of said, but, what if people kind of do bad stuff? And he said, well, why would they do that? Why would they become nurses if they wanted to do bad stuff? He said. He made this wonderful point to me. He said to me, people have only got so much energy. And so I want to design a system where every bit of energy they've got goes to what matters, which is looking after people, and none of their energy is wasted on dealing with systems. Now, if you work in the public sector, just imagine a world where you don't have to waste any energy at all on systems and bureaucracy and form filling, but all of your energy can be put into what really matters, which is the relationship with people. Right? So the reason I've told you that story is because Jos's story has been known for quite a while, and his organisation is quite well known. He goes around the world. But why are there not thousands of organisations like that? And that's because we still have this deeply ingrained view that the only way to control things is through that kind of pyramid, where the creative, well-paid, high-status people at the top and everyone else at the bottom being controlled and lacking autonomy. And by the way, what is the major reason for ill health at work? It's stress. No, it's not, funnily enough. It's not stress. It's lack of autonomy. So stress is a consequence of people having no capacity to have any control, any choice, any discretion. So stress is a secondary effect of the primary cause, which is people's sense of having absolutely no capacity to be able to express themselves, take responsibility. So that's a problem. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'll speed up and so I finish in just 5 minutes. So the first problem is that elitism, which still pervades our organisations and our education system. We need a profound commitment to devising organisations which empower everybody within them, and an education system which instills a love of learning in all children and works to understand the passion that everybody has somewhere. The second thing we need to talk about is resources, because people do need resources to be able to have that sense of agency and creativity. The RSA has become a really high-profile advocate of universal basic income. which is an idea that's been around for a very, very long time. And we've come to it because of this focus. So we've come to the idea that we should give every citizen just a basic amount of money, just an amount of money to subsist on, not to be rich, but just that money, because that is what will give them a bit of space, a bit of space to think about setting up a business, retraining, volunteering, and also because we need to take the state out of interfering in people's lives in the intrusive way that it does right now. So universal basic income is an idea which would expand people's capacity for agency and creativity. Also, we need to think about how it is we can give everybody assets. 1/3 of people in Britain have effectively no assets at all. The government has just reintroduced the idea of a savings gateway, which is a way of matching people's savings, a policy which actually they abolished in 2010, but, fine. We need to give people just that basic little nest egg. Lots of research shows that if you give people, £5 or £10 extra a week, it makes some impact. But if you give people £500 and say, here's something, a little bit of money you can do something with, that makes an enormous difference to people's sense of agency and their capacity to take risks, to do interesting things with their lives. But we have to think about other things as well, social networks. We've done a lot of work on the RSA on social networks. And what you find, of course, is that social networks are incredibly powerful to opening up people's opportunities and sense of possibility. But social networks are very socially skewed. For example, one of the areas of the greatest segregation of British society is between people who make employment decisions and people who are unemployed. So people who employ people don't know unemployed people, and unemployed people don't know people who employ people. There's all sorts of other ways in which social networks reinforce inequality and lock people out of possibility. So we need to talk about resources, and we need to focus on those resources that matter most. But the final thing, I think, which stands in the way of the kind of vision that I've talked about is the way in which we think about change. So I think there's all sorts of things that are wrong with the way we think about change. There's a kind of right of centre view which says all you need to do to give people a sense of agency is for the state to step out of their lives and leave them to sink or swim. Fine, there's absolutely no evidence this is true. So that's a kind of account which says people don't really need support, they don't need resources, they don't need networks, they don't need agency. Just let people get on with it, and the best people will rise to the top. So that's kind of wrong. But there's also a kind of view on the left which is, well, we need to leave it to the state, really. That's what we need to do. Well, people need the state to sort out their problems for them. And despite the best endeavours of the public sector in all sorts of ways, that's not really proven to be a very powerful theory either. It looks as though the state, whatever its intentions, very often disempowers people. It makes them feel passive. So there's kind of problems with the political discourse, but there's also a problem about us, I think. There's a problem about how we think about change. I think we, the public, kind of tend to think that change is about someone else doing something. We are much better at campaigning than we are innovating. So, there's a lot of talk about mobilising people. And isn't it great that we mobilise people and campaigns mobilise people? Well, they do, and actually, it's quite easy to get people to march behind a banner or sign a petition, because that's all about saying someone else needs to do something. Right? The really hard thing is working out how it is we make change happen ourselves, taking responsibility. It's a much, much harder thing for us to do. So I think lots of organisations, charities and campaign groups, political parties, what they're basically saying is, leave it to us, or someone else needs to do something, and they're not focusing on the really hard work of giving people the kind of support and encouragement that they need to be able to find solutions themselves. We've been kind of robbed of that sense. And when you look back at the history of cities and movements, you can see that it was there at the beginning, but very often it's kind of got washed out. And we need to bring it back, that notion that the key task for us is how it is we work together to solve problems. So that's one of the reasons why the RSA is changing as an organisation. We do speeches like this one. We have about 150 lectures every year, and that's great, and we put all our content online, and millions of people have watched our lectures, and some of our stuff is absolutely fantastic. We do research and practical innovation, and we've got a fellowship of 28,000 fellows, many of whom are in this room. But what we've spent the last couple of years doing is thinking really hard about how it is we develop a different model of change, how it is we're not like a traditional think tank that writes a pamphlet and gives it to a politician and expects them to do something about it. I used to work in government. I used to get those pamphlets. I used to file them in a special round file in the corner of the room. We've got to get, what we're interested in is how do we develop ways of making change happen which combine great ideas, discourse, conversation like this, with mobilising our fellows as people who can make change happen in communities. I want the RSA to be a kind of social movement, but not a social movement against something, but a social movement for things, for creating things. And at our best, in this region and other parts of the country, there are lots of fellows creating solutions, making things happen. So, overall, I'm optimistic. Overall, I think that there is an appetite that people have for self-expression, to have a sense of agency and creativity in their lives. I think young people have it in particular. I think technology can be transformative. I think many of the old ways of doing things are crumbling, and you can see them crumbling, particularly our political institutions. But I also think there are big barriers, and this is a dangerous time because people are very angry and they don't know what to do with their anger. So whilst I'm optimistic, I also think it's really important that we tackle those barriers which stand in the way of what we could be and what we should be, which is a world in which everyone has that sense that they are the authors of their own lives. Thank you.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and Dance City. We're also supported by DC Cafe, who host the events.